In Defense of AI Art by LiquidZulu contains a few good points, as well as several double standards. But I want to talk about it because it demonstrates how there's two schools of thought at play when it comes to AI, the logistic and factual side, and the moral and ethical side. LiquidZulu's video is very much the former, whereas I, like a lot of artists, lean more towards the latter. And both are applicable to the justice system as well as the discussion surrounding generative AI models. Quick disclaimer, please do not leave hateful comments on LiquidZulu's video. I do not condone harassment when it comes to simple debate, and it'll just lead to negative attention being thrown my way as well. The runtime is very long, and Zulu talks a little too quickly for my liking. Despite this, I ended up watching his video twice. So that's 5 hours of my life I'll never get back. My take on AI as a whole comes down to analyzing benefit versus cost. In other words, human flourishing versus suffering. In my first AI-related video, I highlighted how the downsides of AI seem to outweigh benefits. Granted, I didn't provide many sources while doing so, I was simply giving my perspective. But Zulu here has compiled every single argument in favor of AI art, which gives me a chance to agree and disagree with things in more detail, as well as give potential solutions to problems. Ideally, I may even persuade a few pro-AI viewers to question their reasoning in the process. I'll be covering what I feel to be the most important points in his video, but I will be skipping and condensing parts of it because I don't want my video to end up being the same length as his. Also, there are points where I'll have to speak on behalf of artists, but I think that's fair, seeing as I am one and have been following the online community for years. With that, let's dive in. The first argument Zulu presents is that it is, by legal definition, impossible to steal an idea or digital image because neither have any scarcity. I'm guessing what he means is that you can't steal something that can be infinitely reproduced. But I would argue that it's still possible to steal the specific combination of components that make up an appealing idea, which is why intellectual property rights exist in the first place. And in the case of generative AI, there is a theft of labor that is occurring, which I'll get into during my section involving consent. I found this section confusing due to how brief it is, but overall it seems rather pedantic, so I won't spend any more time arguing over a definition. But while we're on the topic, I should point out that even if generative AI were to disappear altogether, no one would be deprived of the ability to make art, meaning no rights, as the pro-AI crowd likes to call it, are being tread upon. To be clear, I'm not necessarily advocating no AI, what I advocate is regulation, something to keep in mind going forward. The following question is, can AI art be plagiaristic? Zulu goes on a spiel about noise filters for a while and describes why the way in which an AI learns is essentially the same as how humans learn. Zulu goes on to say that sufficient evidence needs to be provided for something to be considered a case of plagiarism. This is true. Simply put, present something like this to a judge, that's a pretty easy case of plagiarism. But put this in front of a judge, that's going to be harder to prove. Which is why I find all this talk about machine learning to be irrelevant, because all plagiarism boils down to is what things look like in the eyes of humans, and what can be effectively argued in court. But if we need to factor machine learning into the legal system, then we can also loosen our definition of plagiarism, seeing as generative AI is extremely new, the law is not black and white, and has been subject to change over the course of all of human history. During this section, Zulu uses a quote from Adam Duff that seems to support his claim that AI is capable of learning. Adam suggests that what AI is taking away from artists is the process of art making. What Zulu fails to notice here is that what Adam is referring to as the process in this case is a sacrifice of time and energy, which is not present in many uses of AI because convenience is what makes it appealing in the first place. So this doesn't actually support his claim at all. Zulu insists that it's nonsensical for artists to be concerned with giving proper credit while constantly emulating each other's styles in their own works, and because art collectives aren't required to compensate the descendants of some, quote, random caveman. First of all, AI models cannot integrate new information into their programming the same way humans can, as explained by Jimmy McGee in his video.
If you train a neural network to recognize text, like the example at the beginning of the video, It'll do a good job when you give it text. But if you give it something it's never seen before, like a weird math symbol or a picture of a dog, the AI is still going to guess what letter it is. It's just a program. It can't integrate new information the way a person could. Sure, you can retrain it with thousands of dog pictures, but we can hardly call that intelligence. I encountered this exact problem when I was trying to recognize text in some PDF files. Adobe Acrobat tries its best, but it just has to guess when it sees an equation, and it doesn't have the vocabulary to describe stuff like this. You wouldn't say that the program is lying because it got something wrong. It just wasn't designed to recognize math.
To address Zulu's other point, that's why the public domain exists. Creative works enter the public domain 70 years after the death of the creator. Anything published prior to 1999 has a lesser time constraint from 50 all the way down to just 14 years after death. Rosalind Franklin University does point out that the Copyright Extension Act of '98 is mockingly referred to as the Mickey Mouse Protection Act, as it was pushed by Disney in an effort to protect their own IP. While I may not agree with Disney lengthening the amount of time required to 70 years, the idea is to give the immediate descendants of an artist a chance to also profit from their work, after which the public can do whatever they want with it. No compensation or credit required. No one expects you to credit cavemen if you take a picture of a cave painting. Zulu's argument overall is that AI itself is not a tool of plagiarism, but humans can plagiarize by using it, and that creating a monopoly on styles would be the death of creativity. I agree with that second part, but I see an inconsistency here. If AI really does learn similar to how a human does, and people can plagiarize, then one of two things needs to be true. AI is more human than machine, meaning it can plagiarize, or AI is more machine than human, meaning it cannot plagiarize. So which is it? They can't both be true at the same time, since it's impossible for the answer to be exactly 50-50. And each answer is going to come with its own legal and ethical considerations. I'll often see the pro-AI crowd jump between these two answers to fit their own narrative. In my first video, I pointed out that AI is really just a marketing term, and I received a comment saying, well, okay, it's not real AI, it's a neural network. But eventually it'll be real. Okay, sure buddy. I would like to point out that we're still making new discoveries about how the human brain works to this day, which is why I think it's hardly comparable to tech that was created by humans and that's only been around for the past few years. So I'm proceeding with the second statement. I'm skipping a few sections here since I don't care to get into any further debate about machine learning, but Zulu eventually raises the question of whether the training data being used in current AI engines was in fact taken without consent. Large image generators such as Stable Diffusion and Midjourney are primarily trained using Lion, a large bank of URLs.
Stable Diffusion uses LION, a tenuous acronym for a dataset of almost 6 billion image-text pairs. The clever thing about LAION is that it just has links to the images, so you can't sue them for copyright infringement. Model makers can download the pictures themselves, and then pivot their research project into a business once the model is up and running.
As shown, Lion is technically legal, but morally questionable, much in the same way that terms and service agreements and fine print in contracts are considered predatory because they're designed in such a way that deters you from actually reading them, which is why they alone can't always be considered as consent in court. Zulu seems to agree with me on that point. He does point out that publicly posting images online communicates that you are allowing anyone to view them. I agree. He then raises what I think is a valid argument from the anti-AI crowd. I may be consenting to other people viewing my work online, but not robots. He claims that this is the same as saying that you only consented to Mongolians viewing your work and not non-Mongolians. Why are we treating bots the same as people? You see what I mean? He can't make up his mind between human and machine despite the two of them being fundamentally different concepts. In any case, Zulu and I already agree that terms and service contracts are legally flimsy, meaning the argument that simply using an online platform communicates explicit consent is not bulletproof. And I'll add that just because something is public doesn't mean you can do whatever you want within it. It may be difficult for the pro-AI crowd to understand this since, judging from the tone of this video, a lot of them are devoid of empathy, but an artist's body of work tends to be very intertwined with their identity, or in lamer legal terms, their brand. It's legal to take someone's photo without consent if they're in a public space, but keep taking photos of them and that can be considered harassment. If a photo is meant for commercial use, then you need to either blur out everyone's face or have them sign a consent form. If you decide to spray paint the side of a public building and take a photo of it, you've now committed vandalism. This comes down to intent, a part of fair use, which I'll be explaining in more detail near the end. Zulu then presents the question, is it immoral to train an AI on data acquired without consent, and claims that raising such a question amounts to pissiness, which I'll be coming back to shortly. This would be a good place to mention that, like most advancements in society, the foundations of generative AI are built on what might as well be slave labor.
Turkers were earning a median $2 per hour in 2018, and the situation hasn't really changed in the years following. These people are invisible, poor, and very easy to exploit. Mechanical Turk is slavery as a service, but it was also the first of a new breed. Turkers are generalists, but the AI revolution needed specialists. Appen is one of many companies specifically selling data labeling for machine learning. Their crowdsourced labor came mostly from Kenya and the Philippines at first, but when Venezuela's economy collapsed, they started snapping up jobless refugees. A journalist for MIT profiled a Venezuelan Appen worker, and the situation seems pretty dire. Workers have no line of communication with the company. They have to be constantly at their computers, ready to accept tasks, and like Mechanical Turk, the site barely works. Appen can afford to push people as hard as they want, because there's a huge labor supply and the workers have nowhere else to go.
It's very important to think of data in the case of training sets as crowdsourced labor. Whether it's photos, paragraphs in an article, or questionable furry art, labor went into producing those things. No matter the process of how AI uses it, that much needs to be considered from an ethical standpoint, because AI models would not exist without the data. So to reiterate, what are the benefits of AI and why do they justify the cost? This section really highlights how Zulu's video is all about objective fact. He tries to use deductive reasoning to determine whether the public is deserving of compensation for their data, which doesn't make any sense. Ethics are not objective, they're subjective. It's about weighing several different factors to arrive at a balanced answer. Zulu eventually uses the iceberg analogy to illustrate the entitlement of artists, which I find very interesting, since I can use the same analogy to explain why he hates them so much. The top of the iceberg represents artists with relatively large platforms, such as Sam Does Arts, Carlo Ortiz, Adam Duff, etc. The 1% or so of artists who, through a combination of hard work and lucky circumstances, are actually able to make a living off their art. The bottom of the iceberg represents the many current artists who, for various reasons, are not able to significantly profit off their work, despite some of them being very skilled at what they do. This is called survivorship bias. Art is hard and takes a lot of time, but now we can compete with you elitist artists by using AI. Art isn't beneficial to society. You should have gotten a real job like bricklaying. You're trying to monopolize styles and ideas. Your failed business model is not my problem. The fact that most artists in society are invisible is why the question, is it immoral to train AI on data acquired without consent, does not amount to pissiness at all, because again, training data is just crowdsourced labor. Zulu then makes the wild suggestion that artists would prefer that they get paid rather than AI being used to cure Alzheimer's. As far as I'm aware, no artist has ever said this, he just made it up in his head. At least my disdain towards tech companies comes from past instances of fraud, negligence, slave labor. Cases of artists attempting to monopolize styles are few and far between and is already something that's frowned upon within the community. What Zulu is essentially arguing here is that artists wanting to be paid despite their flawed business models can be considered entitlement, but his unregulated usage of the crowdsourced labor of literally millions of people is not, somehow? Sounds like a double standard to me. I'll note here that artists don't care as much about the compensation part. We don't do art solely for money because there are clearly more lucrative fields out there. We do it because we find it fulfilling. Compensation would just ease some of the pain of having to see the work of our peers and colleagues getting mixed and matched across the entire internet. as well as help out all those invisible artists that are conveniently never addressed. Zulu suggests that artists are ungrateful to the many advancements of civilization that have come about through hard labor, but here he's just making the same double standard he accuses artists of making. You should be appreciative of the janitor keeping public spaces clean, just as you should be appreciative of a music artist putting their work on Spotify for next to nothing. You can't claim that the world is built on the backs of manual laborers without saying the exact same thing about artists. And those two things are not mutually exclusive, by the way. You can be a blue-collar worker and still call yourself an artist who makes art. He attempts to justify this by insinuating that back in the olden days, art was a frivolous pursuit that benefited no one because it was more important that people keep themselves fed, as if there weren't also artists back then who still managed to make things during whatever spare time they had, and whose efforts we are likely enjoying today in some form or another, and whose names we will never know. Zulu makes an even wilder claim that artists, quote, have the fucking nerve to wish innovation halted, lest it open up artistry to more people. This is the take I audibly laughed at because of how absurd it is. Putting aside the fact the use of the word innovation here is debatable, I would love to see more art being made in the world. I want to teach people things. Artists get enjoyment out of collaborating with and supporting each other. Zulu backs up this claim by cherry-picking 3 different quotes, which do sound pretentious on the surface, but as someone who is a part of the art community, I recognize this attitude doesn't come from artists not wanting other people to create things. It comes from the existential fear that AI creates and a disappointment that people are choosing to rely on image generators rather than learning the skills of art making from them. I would never claim to be as capable as a professional plumber simply because I'm capable of using a plunger, and I don't think insulting the people who can provide you with the skills to make the things you so desperately want to make is a very good idea. To summarize, this section is littered with strawmanning and can be discarded. I imagine most people would feel a lot better about tech companies harvesting their data if they had real evidence that it was all in some way for the greater good of humanity. If asking for compensation for my data is entitlement, and tech companies are altruistic at heart, then surely I should at least be able to use these image generators for free, right? Currently, Stable Diffusion and Midjourney both require a monthly subscription. Zulu rightfully points out that even large tech companies are made up of individuals who also deserve to be paid for their labor, and that these companies need to generate profits before they can invest into the really innovative stuff. But again, how do we know that's what's going to happen? In a later section, Zulu provides a quote from Evan Conrad, a developer working in Silicon Valley, as not evidence, but rather a suggestion that these developers do have good intentions.
Steven has this thing in his video that I think maybe misunderstands what all of these things are. A lot of these projects are not made by standard moneyed interests. They're made by people who legitimately think they are building utopia. And I'm relatively confident that they are building at least something very large that might lead to utopia. They are quite confident that they are building AGI, and that's probably true. And make a world in which they never have poverty, shit is just all free, and they don't have cancer because we cured cancer with it. If you actually believe that, the money doesn't really matter as much. But from my perspective, they don't seem to hire those folks. They seem to hire folks that genuinely think they're trying to create utopia, or trying to prevent some really bad thing from happening.
Aw, what a nice comforting quote. I have a quote too.
Whatever the people involved think they're doing, they're acting as a smokescreen. Selling sentience or superintelligence as the main risk of AI diverts attention from how machine learning is being used, and it positions AI as a force of nature. It's already making objective judgments, it's already intelligent, but we need a lot of money to stop it from doing sci-fi novel things.
All this really tells me is that Silicon Valley is taking advantage of good-natured but naive people who genuinely think they're helping to build something that is unattainable. Constant capitalistic expansion has already wrecked the environment. Is a vague idea of utopia really going to be enough to make big tech willingly, at some point in time, take a financial hit for the greater good? I've asked pro-AI people before what kind of progress AI actually entails, and their responses have all amounted to, "Trust me bro, you just gotta wait." To quote what is probably my favorite comment under Jimmy McGee's video, companies are more willing to dump money into technology that will reduce costs than consumers are willing to spend on things that will actually make their lives better. Oh, see what I did? See what I did there? I gave credit. Scary, I know. What I think is a lot more likely is that big tech simply continues to generate profit through AI gimmicks while leaving everyone else to deal with a dying economy. In the previous section, Zulu brings up Timnit Gebru, a former ethics commissar for big tech who explains that AI tech labs are hesitant to look into any issues that are brought up to avoid litigation. But Zulu refutes this by saying, quote, "In reality, big tech wants to be innovating, wants to be creating, but they must avert resources into defending themselves from frivolous lawsuits brought forth by the incompetent masses." He conveniently doesn't provide a source for that part. So to give my own take, there wouldn't have been nearly as much public outcry if developers had taken the time and care to train AI models on consensual and public domain material in the first place. Which is exactly what developers would have done had lawsuits been a real concern to them. They're just doing whatever they think they can legally get away with. And if these companies are getting hit with lawsuits, good, they deserve it. Here's a question: could building generative AI off of crowdsourced labor without consent and profiting off it, eventually leading to investors pulling out due to bad press, also be considered a failed business model? It's worth mentioning here that AI models become exponentially more expensive to train over time, and that they'll likely hit an improvement ceiling as they run out of fresh material to work with. Combine that with the lawsuits, legitimate or not, that have undoubtedly been occurring over the past couple years, and investors may eventually decide AI simply isn't worth the hassle and back out entirely. This section is supposed to be about Marxism, but mostly consists of unhinged ranting, so I'm just going to hone in on some specific points. Zulu brings up a quote from Duchess Celestia, who says that image generators would still be a problem even if they were trained on ethically sourced materials. And I will push back on this mindset. In my own opinion, AI models would be fine if they were trained ethically. If people still want to use generative AI to make things, that's their choice. Though I doubt that ethical models would have nearly as much appeal, seeing as a lot of AI images look like they were lifted directly from ArtStation. The biggest problem I have with current models is that they not only impinge on creative markets, but are also using artists' own skill sets against them, which is pretty f***ed up. I can only imagine how voice actors feel hearing their own voices being used in every other TikTok and Instagram reel. But people do impressions all the time. Yeah, and how many people do you think can do every impression with 90% accuracy? The answer is zero. Zero people can do that, which is why we need regulation. Zulu goes on to describe Duchess Celestia's account of a recent scam in which people are commissioning artists only for a rough sketch, and then somehow using AI to generate the rest of the artwork from that sketch. He claims that this is evidence of artists being afraid of competition, which, yeah, I guess that's accurate in this case. And I don't know that you can really call it a scam if the artist is still being paid for what they were hired for. The issue I see with this isn't so much the competition that it creates, but rather how it devalues the work of artists even further and only fuels this vitriolic attitude that certain people, such as Zulu here, seem to have towards artists as a whole. This is a last-minute addition, but I learned while putting this together that there's now an AI tool floating around that can produce fake time-lapse videos. This is why artists are sick of this shit. There is quite literally no other reason for this to exist other than to deceive people. The benefits AI provides to artists who are actually in creative fields are minimal, whereas the opportunities it gives to online con artists are limitless. Zulu also states that, quote, "the restrictive policies being advocated by people in the name of artists are not a universal benefit. Rather, these policies, like all protectionism, benefit the least effective producers of art at the expense of everyone else." Now, I'm not well read on protectionism, but I don't know if you've noticed, content farms have been getting even worse here on YouTube and other platforms.
By scraping the internet, people can use AI to copy and paste already existing news articles to direct traffic to their sites and thus earn ad revenue. Plus, AI bots can be employed to comment on content and thus increase engagement, pushing the algorithm to believe rehashed crap is actually worth engaging with, thus boosting even more traffic. Unfortunately, the internet has gotten to the stage where AI will see other generated trash and take that as well, meaning articles that have been rewritten, often with factual errors or differences in tone, are being treated as legit and just keep on spreading.
So that seems to have already happened, and AI is only making it worse. You could argue, well, maybe people can crank out shitposts even faster now, but we should just let the market decide what people want instead of trying to stamp out competition, as Zulu puts it. Another question, what if the market itself has become a biased algorithm? Just about all of my drawing videos have received comments saying how helpful they are, yet most of them don't make it past 1,000 views because they're not clickbaity enough. This argument seems to be under the assumption that social media as a whole actually knows what consumers want, which is misleading. This is where Zulu finally brings up a good point. Is it not a double standard to complain about job loss in artistic fields while suggesting that manual labor jobs be replaced instead? And I agree to an extent. Manual labor jobs have been facing the threat of automation for years, long before AI, many of which people rely on, and that's something to be considerate of. However, Zulu frames this as elitism, as artists claiming their jobs to be inherently more important than others. This is where I disagree, because that's not what artists are suggesting. No one wants to work in a sewer or on an oil rig in the middle of the ocean, right? People do those jobs because someone has to, and they're desperate for hazard pay. So why not focus on automating only the most dangerous jobs in society while, sorry to sound like a soy boy liberal, taxing the rich more heavily, thereby redistributing wealth in the form of a universal basic income so that we all have more time for creative pursuits. That, I believe, is what artists are suggesting. AI art, to me, is a symptom of a larger disease. People feel as though they don't have enough time in their day in order to get legitimately good at something. And tech billionaires are the ones protecting the status quo, not artists. Realistically, a fully automated society would not function, so it comes down to balancing the labor load equally while using things like AI for efficiency and leaving people with enough time and resources to pursue their own interests. Here Zulu brings up another valid point. Is it not hypocritical to say you're only against certain forms of AI while using other AI tools? In my first video, I brought up an example of me using a free AI filter to convert a photo into a manga-style background. Now, does this come with ethical concerns? If we pretend that the photo I'm using here is a stock photo, then that would remove that part from the equation. But then what about the filter? I'm going to assume that, like every other AI tool, it was trained on scraped images. But don't most manga artists already trace and use filters and 3D models for their backgrounds to keep up with deadlines? Is manga-style background too generic to even be copyrightable? Putting all that aside, this filter is really only slightly better than filters that are already found in Clip Studio. I imagine there are plenty of alternatives to AI tools provided one takes the time to look for them. And I think us artists can all agree that if AI were to disappear entirely tomorrow, it would not be a very big loss to the art world. Some artists are trying to find good uses for AI as a means of coping with the massive cost that comes with it. Supposedly things like Photoshop's generative fill tool were made through licensed means, which I'm going to assume means everyone involved in the making of it received some form of payment. I'm not so concerned about a few Photoshop tools as I am about whatever Adobe plans on doing next in light of recent changes to their terms of use. Yes, I enjoy the many conveniences that technology provides, but I find the notion that I can't partake in society while also critiquing it to be nonsensical. We're all guilty of it after all, especially those of us in first world countries. Most of the clothes we wear were made in sweatshops, and every new technology is built with some amount of blood. Does collective guilt make it any less relevant? Why would that make it not worth talking about? If simply voicing concern about new technology makes me a Luddite, then why is that so bad? Zulu makes yet another good point. Just as AI isn't going away anytime soon, neither is the desire to support human artists. I allude to this at the end of my first video, and I do believe that marketing artwork as being human-made could make it more valuable going forward. So, good news. Maybe artistic careers aren't as threatened as we thought. And when I think about it, people who are content with AI images are probably the same people who will argue with you in your DMs about pricing, so AI could be filtering out those people from your pool of potential clients, which isn't much of a loss, seeing as no one wants to do business with those types anyways. After that are several sections getting into the definition of art, which I'm skipping because I really don't give a shit. I assume these sections are aimed more at the pretentious, abstract, and modern art side of the community, which I've never been a big fan of myself, and honestly I think a lot of it is just there for money laundering. As I say in my second AI-related video, I personally don't care how people choose to define art, and it is the least of my concerns when it comes to AI. If I were to define it, I'd say it's anything creative in nature. Art involves taking raw materials and previous combinations and synthesizing something new from them. That could involve anything from painting and pottery to cooking or even sports. Zulu, you put together a painfully long video essay. Pat yourself on the back because you, sir, are an artist. Whether I like the video or not doesn't matter. You made something that did not previously exist, put a lot of yourself into it, and showed it off to the world. Congratulations. I will point out that in one of these sections, Zulu describes why generative AI does in fact require extensive knowledge and effort, especially when defending Shadiversity later in his video, which makes for another set of conflicting arguments. The pro-AI crowd will go on about how revolutionary and efficient AI is because it saves so much time and effort, while simultaneously claiming it has just as much artistic merit as other fields because it requires so much time and effort. So, like last time, we need to pick one because these statements are in contention with each other. I won't be the deciding factor on this because I want to move on, but I'm just saying, y'all need to make up your minds. Digital tools make art making a lot more convenient, but the only reason I know how to draw with a tablet is because I can already draw traditionally. I suggest the pro-AI crowd take some time to ponder whether their use of generative AI is actually an advancement or is just depriving them of a skill set that would give them more satisfaction. Zulu goes on to argue that AI does in fact democratize art because it makes it more accessible to the disabled, the examples he gives being extreme fringe cases. Stephen Hawking and Paul Alexander, who spent most of his life inside of an iron lung after contracting polio during childhood. Zulu neglects to give his full name and instead refers to him as Polio Paul because he doesn't actually give a shit about disabled people, he just wants to use them as a talking point. I personally know people with vision problems who still manage to make visual art. I follow Cross-Eyed Comics on Instagram who is legally blind and still makes entire comic pages. I follow Cope.Arts, who suffers from mental illness and who manages to make money selling watercolors online and who uses art as a means of coping with her disability. By the way, Zulu, Paul Alexander also made art, which you would have known had you bothered to Google his f***ing name. He goes on to demonstrate that he himself has a tremor, which makes it difficult to hold a pencil steady, but Zulu admits that this alone doesn't make him disabled, so it's not even relevant to the conversation. The reason I felt it appropriate to comment on behalf of Kim Jong-hee and how he would have felt about his art being fed into a generator after his death is because I appreciate his work. I've watched his process videos. I own one of his art books. It's not death worship, Zulu, it's called showing some goddamn respect. Near the end of this section, Zulu suggests that AI could somehow do away with opportunity costs, which is the pinnacle of entitlement to me. No one person can be good at everything, no matter how advanced AI gets. All of my interests are solitary in nature, which means I don't have a social life. I don't have what it takes to compete in the Olympics, but you don't hear me complaining about that. Pursuing one option will always mean sacrificing other options. Deal with it. To put my own spin on Zulu's words here, your opportunity cost is not my problem. Shortly after this, Zulu mentions that AI could make iterations faster, which I actually agreed with in my first video, though I can easily see clients trying to turn this in their favor. Typically an agreement is established between the artist and the client that only the first 1 or 2 revisions are included in the price, after which revisions cost extra. And some freelancers may establish a maximum amount of revisions that can be made. But now clients will say that we have access to AI now, so they should get as many revisions as they want for little to no additional pay. As an artist, I see this as being more annoying than helpful. Okay, almost at the end here. Zulu talks about the bullying of people for being pro-AI, because yes, a lot of artists demonize AI tools and feel strongly about them because why wouldn't they given everything that AI entails? And I agree that Austin McConnell, who I bring up in my first video, made ethical considerations as to how he was using said tools and that he had valid reasons for doing so. And I agree that he was treated unfairly by his audience. This is unrelated, but I learned not long after making that video that he actually suffered a stroke during surgery, and I'm hoping he bounces back from it. Zulu also brings up Shadiversity being unfairly targeted for teaching others how to use image generators, but a little detail he fails to mention is that Shad's own brother is none other than Jazza, a prominent artist here on YouTube. And I'm not the first person to point out how tragic it is that Shad feels the need to rely on AI rather than simply learning from or even collaborating with his own sibling. I will cut Shad some slack since he clearly knows a lot of his fundamentals and some of his drawings are actually quite good. So much so, in fact, that applying a generative filter over top really does them a disservice. All of the AI art that Shadiversity shows off in his video amounts to realistic photo bashing. I suppose it's subjective, but in my opinion, what Shad is gaining in efficiency through AI, he's losing in the personalized appeal and cohesion of his traditional and digital art, which is not a very good trade-off. Zulu talks about Corridor Digital, who I bring up in my Counterpoints video, and in that video I do refer to Corridor as being dishonest and or out of touch for being pro-AI, and you know what, I'll revoke that part since they are a VFX channel and can't really be blamed for experimenting with a technology they didn't create to begin with. I do still think their follow-up video was very tone-deaf. With all of that said, I've received a few negative comments on my anti-AI videos, and honestly, I was hesitant to even make this one because I'm concerned about my artwork being targeted by pro-AI weirdos simply because they want to taunt me, but I went ahead anyways. Zulu does acknowledge the fact that bullying goes both ways near the end of this section, but at that point, what are you really trying to argue? If you're trying to say that we should all be a little more understanding of each other's perspectives, then I agree. That's why I'm making this video. Also, during this clip between two artists, one of them mentions that being able to produce more work with fewer employees could make indie studios a lot more viable, which makes sense. But whether AI is actually capable of handling multiple roles within a studio remains to be seen. The reason animators chose to use AI for Marvel's Secret Invasion credit sequence is because they were going for a surreal, melty aesthetic. And this is only my theory, but I suspect the reason all the video clips we've seen from Sora AI are only 10 seconds long is because it can't produce anything longer than that without a dramatic dive in quality. In his final section, Zulu brings up fan art as another double standard. How can you claim that profiting off of derivatives of a particular artist made using AI is any different than profiting off of fan art of a pre-existing character? Let's take a moment to talk about fair use, that thing I mentioned earlier. Legally, there are 4 factors that are considered to determine whether something falls under fair use: the purpose and character of use, the nature of the copyrighted work, the amount or substantiality of the portion used, and the effect of the use on the potential market or value of the work. The one I want to hone in on is Factor 3, amount or substantiality. Simply put, the less of an original work you use, the safer you are. Amount is easy to define for video use. Season 1 of Chainsaw Man contains 12 episodes, which comes to a total of 4 hours 48 minutes. My video essay using said footage is only 18 minutes, which isn't even a quarter. Furthermore, a single episode is approximately 20 minutes, but my video is still less than that and is composed of clips from multiple episodes. Purpose and character of use also comes into play here. Educational uses or commentary have less restrictions. Amount used is more difficult to gauge when it comes to most other forms of art. However, in the case of text-to-image generators, it's actually quite easy. The more artist names and other prompts being used, the more legal it is. Only 1 or 2 names will not be enough. An important detail here is that word prompts can be easily hidden from the public, and that hiding online sources is very legally questionable, much in the same way that not putting ingredients on prepackaged food is illegal. This could make for a strong case against text-to-image generators unless users are forced, through regulation, to make their word prompts easily viewable to the public. Of course, it's difficult to enforce anything on a scale as large as the internet. As far as I can tell, marking things as being made with AI is still entirely optional. Factor 1 can also be thought of as intent. If you were to spend several hours producing a single piece of fan art because you enjoy something and want others to enjoy it, that's going to have a lot more legal ground than, oh, I don't know, targeting a specific artist's work in such a way that it can be mass-produced. I like to think of the relationship between fan artists and IPs as being symbiotic. Both parties benefit without directly competing with one another. But this only works if it's obvious enough where fan art originated from. Remove origin from the equation and this relationship falls apart, which is often the case with generative AI. Fan art by its nature will always have a clear source, and if a piece of media is popular enough, it may not even need to be stated for it to be recognized. But make derivatives of an artist without being honest about sources, and they don't get the benefit of publicity, which is why intellectual property and plagiarism claims are important. It is still possible that you'll get DMCA'd when putting fan art up for sale on public platforms, but that's just the risk you take when trying to profit from it, and that risk will vary depending on what it is you're making fan art of. Now, are there uses of image generators that would fall under fair use? Yes, which is why I believe judges should be trained on generative AI ethics, or whatever you want to call it. But for reasons I mentioned earlier, the legal system may not even need to get all that involved for AI to eventually self-implode. Regardless of all that, I personally don't believe any current AI models should be allowed for commercial use due to the whole crowdsourced labor thing. Lastly, Zulu claims that intellectual properties do nothing to support individuals and only benefit companies because IP supposedly limits creativity, which is true when the system is abused, but that does not make copyright inherently bad, just as Zulu argues that AI is not inherently bad. In the words of Wikipedia, fair use is one of the limitations to copyright intended to balance the interests of copyright holders with the public interest in the wider distribution and use of creative works by allowing as a defense to copyright infringement claims. The pro-AI crowd will point to Disney forcing small daycares to remove Mickey Mouse murals from their walls back in 1989 as an example of why copyright is very bad. Is Disney being petty and overprotective of their IP in this case? Yes, because no one's going to the daycare under the belief that the daycare created Mickey Mouse. But on the other hand, people drop their kids off at daycares based on location and convenience, not whatever they decide to put on their walls, which makes this entire thing a non-issue. On top of that, here's a detail that's rarely mentioned. Disney never actually took legal action because the daycare simply replaced the Disney characters with those belonging to Universal Studios and Hanna-Barbera Productions who volunteered as part of a publicity ploy. You realize copyright is what gives these brands any value in the first place, right? You can just make your own IP, find something else to sample, use your imagination. Oh, that music track is copyrighted? Well, that sucks. Guess I'll have to pick from the thousands of copyright-free tracks that are available to me. If it's not clear by now, I don't like Disney's business practices and never have, but the notion that we should do away with copyright altogether is stupid. Some protection will always be better than none, and current AI models infringe on that protection in ways that need to be examined. Also, I can't finish this video without noting that Zulu has a watermark in the corner of his video, so I guess credit and ownership are important to him after all. To summarize, I don't think compensation is the way to go, since trying to enforce something like that on a scale as large as the internet would end up creating more problems than it solves. But none of this would be a problem if current models were dismantled and retrained exclusively on material acquired with consent and found in the public domain. Realistically, it's far too late for that, but I can still fantasize about what could have been. And no, plagiarism claims are not about monopolizing ideas or styles. It's about reaching a mutual agreement as a society as to what's fair and what's not. Some cases are successful while others get thrown out, but either way, people have a legal right to defend their artistic works. AI models may not be inherent tools of plagiarism, but they do make plagiarism even easier than it already was. The internet makes plagiarism easy, but no one's suggesting that we get rid of the internet based solely on that because of the many benefits it provides. Which is why I will once again ask, why do we really need generative AI? Why does it justify this shit? And who benefits from it the most? Should we in the art community maybe loosen our definition of art and stop shaming the people who feel they need to rely on AI in order to make it? I think so. Does the pro-AI crowd lack faith in themselves and fundamentally misunderstand why artists do what they do? Also yes. To give my interpretation of the pro-AI mentality, I think, just like the anti-AI crowd, pro-AI people are scared by the state of the world and they see AI as an easy solution. They want to think that this new technology will magically solve all their problems, which is why they're so quick to defend it. I also think it comes from despair. Price of living is skyrocketing. There are people working long hours who don't have many opportunities to pursue art and feel as though they never will. And part of it is instant gratification. Our current online experience is built on quick dopamine hits that lead some of us to believe that everything needs to have a shortcut. But some things need to be done delicately. This applies to both manual labor and art. I would very much like to believe that Silicon Valley venture capitalists have our best interests at heart, but I'm doubtful due to how empty entertainment has clearly been prioritized in this AI revolution. If LiquidZulu himself would like to provide me with sources of generative AI being effectively implemented in healthcare, pollution control, or other fields essential to human flourishing, I would be more than happy to read. But until then, I worry not so much about the future of artists, but rather how AI has amounted to nothing more than minor convenience built with crowdsourced labor and disguised as innovation. Oh my god, it's done. I'm never making a video this long again.